talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing in the city of Santa Monica, which is in Southern California. Santa Monica is a beachside, oceanside town, and people have a lot of impressions about that. But it's actually a town that's grappling with many of the issues that we've been talking about today in terms of diversity and equity, well-being, life satisfaction, particularly around racial, ethnic issues, as well as economic diversity. So it provides a really nice test bed to talk about how well-being measurement unfolds at the local level and some of the lessons and insights that we've been learning as part of this process. I'm going to talk about that. And of course, I really am representing the City of Santa Monica's team, which is comprised of government and non-governmental organizations, as well as myself as the research collaborator. So this is a homepage from our Wellbeing Project page. A lot of the information that I'll talk about in more descriptive ways through video, through an interactive website is available on a website that's on a later slide deck. So certainly I hope people will take an opportunity to peruse. One of the things that I'm hearing through the course of the morning and the early afternoon is the importance of narrative and cultural shift. And we really approach the work that we did in Santa Monica around the idea that you have to change narrative, measurement, and investment all at the same time. I'll talk mostly about the measurement piece just for the purposes of this kind of presentation, but I have some lessons and insights certainly about some of those other areas that perhaps we'll get to today or in tomorrow's discussion. So I'll talk about kind of how we entered into this in Santa Monica, but then really talk about what their orientation was, their path, and lessons and insights that they've learned. This has been a multi-year effort. They're actually in the third round of the index, and we've been supporting them in some ways. So I can also talk about the promises and pitfalls of that as well. So just to give you some background, now Santa Monica actually started not in the well-being space so much as it was starting in other areas, and it's a great lesson of how you braid other social movements and other social efforts. So Santa Monica is very well known for its efforts in environmental sustainability, and so had a pretty robust, at least 2-decade plus jump start on conversations about well-being. They also were dealing with issues of how to make sure that the young people in Santa Monica felt safe and protected. And prior to our work with them, they had actually a couple of community shootings, some violence, and some issues around mental health and depression. So there were some converging factors that led them and motivated them to not just simply tie those efforts together and Band-Aid, but to do some of the transformative thinking that we've been talking about today to say, wait a minute, we've got to reset and start this whole thing differently and differently oriented. At that same time, kind of in a bit of kismet, Michael Bloomberg started his Mayor's Challenge to try and support cities that were innovating in government. This challenge started in the US, but there have been competitions and awardees in Latin America and in Europe. What was interesting about the competition, and it was quite a few rounds, was that the other 4 winners actually were also set to transform government, but to transform government in a fairly narrow way, important way, but critically narrow. So whether it was improving contracts and procurement processes or changing environmental sustainability around recycling practices, slices of transformation, but not holistic. The city of Santa Monica came in and said, we're going to actually transform around well-being, and we had thought we had absolutely no shot, quite frankly, because it sounded in all the ways that you might imagine, all the narrative challenges that you could contend with. And certainly in the US, there has been many uphill battles with trying to embrace this orientation. Well, thankfully, the city won, and it provided a jump start to some of the transformational conversation that it wanted to have. It was not the only mechanism. The city began to commit day-to-day routine practice to it. But I wanted to put it in context in terms of the earlier conversation about reformation and transformation, because it was hard enough to try and explain it to the award committee out of about more than 800 applications in the US, and to continue to progress and explain, we're going to do this well-being thing, and somehow they were awarded. So this is a great example, and I'll move through this pretty quickly because I think we've been talking about this today. But for the city of Santa Monica, it was about moving beyond local revenue and GDP. It was an opportunity to reimagine how they were partnering outside of government and not just within government. And they wanted to change the narrative that government wasn't just about filling the potholes, but actually had a role and a responsibility to advance the health and the well-being of its residents. And so there were many different narratives that were part of that, including an economic one around innovation and creativity, but also an opportunity for government to reposition itself, not just in lead, but in partnership with other entities in the community. Now, of course, there are great measurement tools, and we built on a lot of them. One of the concerns that we had was that the practice of government wasn't embedded. Some of particularly the local politics. Santa Monica is like a lot of communities, not just in the US, but globally, that is really run by an interesting kind of mix of a city council, a city manager, a mayor, many levels of cultural and political narratives flowing through, and understanding how to integrate that with the great science of well-being by many in this room and on the phone today with the practice of local government, and particularly local messy government. How could we do this around a common well-being agenda, and then how could we eventually tie it to budget and resource allocation? We thought a lot about sequencing, and so we didn't come out of the gate saying that this was going to reform local budget or be a lens or a filter on budget, but that was always a part of the process. So we thought about how do we introduce these concepts and integrate that accordingly. But this is what motivated the community of Santa Monica. The project essentially had 3 phases. It's not as linear as I'm going to describe, only for the virtue of structuring a presentation. We wanted to pull in a lot of the work that had been done by many of you and those around the world in terms of defining what well-being meant for Santa Monica, then moving to measurement and action. But even in the definition stage, we were doing a lot of visioning with residents, with community organizations, as well as government leaders to think about end use and narrative from the beginning and as part of a dynamic process. We also brought together a lot of leaders from around the world, experts, as you will, to talk about the framework, but that was actually not the only piece of it. We married that with trying to understand what would work in community and cultural context of Santa Monica, and then tried to blend those things into a framework that would, match the smell test in terms of well-being policy and practice and science, but would also be manageable for the city of Santa Monica. And as I'll show you in a minute, transferability always was a goal of this, and we've done workshops with other cities that are now adopting this framework, principally in the US, but not exclusively. And as we approached it, we said, look, we're not going to change everyone to the exact same indicators. It is simply impossible at local government to reconstruct everybody's data systems around the same set of indicators. But we can start to get people to think about comparable dimensions and subdimensions, and that was really our orientation, combining grassroots and outside expert input as well. So this is the framework that we came up with, and I won't go into too much detail, but gives you a sense of what emerged from a pretty long formative and discovery period by design. So we had essentially 5 core dimensions. They won't be new to the discussions today. And then we really worked through a pretty involved process of prioritization and consideration of what were going to be the right subdimensions that captured what we were trying to do to progress local government, but also had some flexibility that other communities, if they wanted to pick this up, could adopt the dimensions and subdimensions at the top, but their sample measures might vary based on their local, cultural, and community needs. The other piece of this is that we wanted to bridge subjective and so-called objective well-being that you heard John and others talk about today. And we wanted to take advantage of lots of different types of data that were coming into cities, certainly at the time that we started, and have only grown in recent years. So this included a resident survey that was absolutely critical to capture some of those subjective components. But we also wanted to combine things that are not only classic objective measures of economic progress or voting or volunteering or things like that, but things that city agencies are collecting, because we knew they were collecting a lot of data, and this would be an opportunity to help them start to think about why they're collecting those data and whether a lot of those data points actually matter for well-being. And so this was as much about building this as it was going through the exercise of local government culture. We also brought together social data, so we used Twitter and Instagram and at the time Foursquare data, because that was increasingly part of local government conversation. Now at the time, it was kind of humorous, this was before our current president in the US, I said, well, you're not gonna make policy based on tweets. Suppose I was wrong, but I still submit to the local government level. It's a piece of the puzzle. It is not the total. So that's kind of how we approached our framework development. We really wanted to bring together questions and analysis. We wanted to make sure that we could look at cross-cutting things that would bring the community together, but we also know the value of variation and understanding zip code variation. Santa Monica does have 5 very distinct zip codes with very different experiences, and that allowed us to think in more targeted ways. And this was all about action, solutions, and response. It would not have had the uptake in terms of the community if we didn't have that front and center. And as I mentioned at the outset, we started through the lens of end use and application. We didn't end there. So I'll just run through this very quickly because I think it just gives kind of an illustrative of what kinds of things that we were trying to capture. As a reminder, we had 5 core dimensions that led up to this idea of outlook. And so outlook might be, how you might think about in terms of are people experiencing their lives better, the Cantrell ladder and other things like that. And so we certainly selected items that could be benchmarked, but we weren't beholden to benchmarks, and that's probably a point of discussion and debate. It was most important that it worked for Santa Monica, that they could check progress over time, and certainly have those comparisons where relevant, but not get caught up in it. Oftentimes with city governments, they're like, well, how do we compare with X, Y, and Z? It was much more important for us to help them build the narrative and the policy framework that would have lasting potential and sustainability in the city. So this is just an example. People think of Santa Monica, as I said, as the beachside, oceanside town. We started to see growing indications of stress, and in other items that I won't share here, those items that you might expect in terms of loneliness, social connection, and community were shocking to the city government because they prided themselves on a pretty happy place. And as we started to kind of differentiate and look by zip code, that was not the case. So we looked at things like emotional states, as you heard earlier, kind of hedonic measures. But we also took into account things like life satisfaction, evaluative, eudaimonia measures, and we pulled in things like Twitter and Instagram to try and capture what was going on in the city, just to give you kind of a sense of the various data pulls that we pulled in. We also looked at community and sense of connection. This was, of course, central. It's part of the social fabric that you've heard others talk about today. And we looked at things like networks and community identity and civic engagement. Again, a lot of that does come from a resident survey and social data for subjective well-being. But we really use this as an opportunity to push the city conversations about what they were capturing in their administrative data that could also indicate something about the social fabric and the community connections in their neighborhoods and community overall. So for example, this classic question, can you count on your neighbors? Well, Santa Monica, again, thinks pretty well of itself and in many ways, and they should, but in this area, they were stunned again, that they thought they would be at least comparable to the US, if not greater. We looked at things like civic engagement. Santa Monica is a high voting town, but did not feel engaged in civic participation. This is a town certainly where people come out for town council and city council meetings and they express themselves. I have borne witness to that, but they do not feel that that actually translates into implementation and impact, and that's critical. So these provided indicator level, but also dimension level inputs that then help to inform action planning and targeted solutions for the city, which they're continuing to work on. We also looked at what we called place and planet, and really it was about the physical and social environment. Here we're talking about natural environment, built environment, issues around mobility and accessibility. One of the things about well-being that was important for Santa Monica, just like we've heard about, it's not just about papering over equity issues with respect to economics and race, ethnicity. It's also not about papering over issues around health and disability. And so we wanted to make sure that that was part of the discussion as well. And again, using survey and administrative data. We actually constructed a couple of indexes, sub-indexes, as part of this effort, although ultimately we present data by dimensions and not only in a roll-up score. And we wanted to start thinking about things like natural amenities that many of you have done with your own GIS and other mapping, but also start thinking about well-being detractors and well-being amenities. So this is an example of things that we pulled together and started to use the language of well-being detractors as opposed to saying, you know, bad stuff in a neighborhood, which is what maybe local policymakers would say, or things detrimental to your health. True, all true, but by starting to tag things with this language, it started to seed a different conversation and a different consciousness. Again, things that were just stunning to the city of Santa Monica. It is a beachside community. People should be using the outdoors, and they were not. Another dimension in our framework was around lifelong learning, and so we really thought a lot about what that would look like, and not just in terms of achievement like you might expect here, but really about learning across the lifespan, which is part of enrichment and aging in place and aging well. So this was a piece of our dimension framework. And then of course we thought about health, which certainly looks at some of the experiences of health and health amenities in the community, but also other aspects of physical and emotional health. And then finally, we looked at living and thriving, which was really about economic opportunity. We did ask people about whether they could live in Santa Monica over the life course, and that was critical because this was a place that was losing a population as they moved into later adulthood. But we also used tweets and other things to capture sentiment that you wouldn't have gotten in a survey. And then we started to present things by zip code, as you might imagine, and start thinking about the experience of well-being and the overlay of those detractors. Maps certainly are very powerful for policymakers, and seeing how those things co-occur can tell a critical story. So lastly, I'll just wrap up by saying the index really was about action, and there's been many ways that this has been disseminated through tools and videos and interactive guides, but the more important things are the kinds of things that we've done with the city to continuously reintroduce the framework, think about how it fit with other efforts that were going on in the city. So ultimately now Santa Monica is a city that thinks about sustainability and well-being together. Engage with partners as part of movement building and develop products that were not just labeled Santa Monica government, but other entities owning it. And then this has now been part of the community plans. These are just examples of this. It's part of governance, and they're starting to think about how they add a governance dimension more explicitly in this work as well. And then I won't go just for the interest of time, but we can talk about it later. I think the issues of translating goals to action does take time, and we can talk about how we sequenced and thought about data culture as well as organizational and political culture. We talked a lot about sequencing our uptake so that we understood how people receive information, when they're ready to move to the next level, as opposed to throwing everything at them in the first pitch. And then finally, a big point for me is cities collect a lot of data. It's not a data issue. It's a selection and a signal issue of what data is actually going to give the best value for the outcomes that they're trying to seek. And we tried to help them think about that in ways that were parsimonious and catalytic. And then finally, thinking about how to do this in day-to-day practice. We have a lot of lessons about that in terms of operationally what can work and what can't work, and how you embed it so that it was another initiative that ultimately didn't have buy-in and adoption. So I will stop there and move on.